There's a specific kind of silence that only exists out on the water. It's not the absence of sound, exactly. It's more like the world is holding its breath. If you've ever spent a sunset in the middle of a lake, miles from the nearest paved road, you know the feeling. The rhythmic times, twip-plop times of your paddle breaking the surface, the way the hull of the kayak slices through the glass-like water with a soft, persistent hiss. It's hypnotic. For most of my life, that sound was my sanctuary. I grew up in a house where the garage was more of a boat shed than a place for cars. My father was a purist. He didn't care for motors. He taught me that if you wanted to truly see the heart of the wilderness, you had to earn it with your shoulders and your back. We spent our summers tracing the veins of the Pacific Northwest, portaging through thickets of hemlock and cedar to reach lakes that hadn't seen a motorized craft in decades. Those memories are bathed in a warm, golden light. The smell of pine resin, the taste of lukewarm canteen water, and the bone-deep ache of a productive day. But the water is different now, or maybe I'm the one who's changed. About 5 years ago, I took a solo trip to a place called Black Pine Reach. It's a jagged finger of water tucked away in a remote corner of the Cascades. It's not a popular spot, mostly because the hike in is a brutal 3-mile haul with a boat on your back, but the payoff was supposed to be worth it. Crystal clear water, ancient trout, and a level of isolation that's becoming harder to find in the modern world. I arrived at the shoreline just as the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the peaks. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and coming frost. I remember feeling that familiar surge of excitement as I slid my faded red kayak into the shallows. The water was so clear it felt like I was floating on air, the rocks on the bottom looking close enough to touch despite being 10 feet down. For the first hour, it was perfect. I paddled toward the northern end of the reach, where the cliffs rise straight out of the water like the walls of a cathedral. The only sound was the occasional cry of an eagle and the steady, comforting beat of my own heart. But as the shadows began to stretch across the surface, the atmosphere shifted. It started with a smell. At first, I thought it was just stagnant water trapped in a cove, but it was sharper than that. It was the heavy, cloying scent of wet fur and something metallic like old pennies. I paused, resting my paddle across my lap, letting the kayak drift. I scanned the shoreline, expecting to see a bloated deer carcass or maybe a bear fishing in the shallows. The silence hit me then. The eagles had stopped screaming. The wind had died down to a dead calm. The lake was a mirror, reflecting the darkening sky with haunting precision. I looked toward the eastern bank, where a dense thicket of old-growth timber crowded the water's edge. About 50 yards away, something was standing in the shadows. My brain did that thing where it tries to rationalize the irrational. It's a stump, I told myself. A trick of the light. A black bear standing on its hind legs. But as I stared, the stump shifted. It was tall, unnaturally tall and thin. It looked like a person, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms seemed to hang down past the knees, and the skin, if you could call it that, had the matte grayish texture of a drowned log. It didn't move like an animal. It didn't twitch or sniff the air. It just stood there, watching me. I felt a cold prickle of sweat break out along my spine. I'm a rational person, or at least I try to be, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to move. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded thin and fragile against the vastness of the lake. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a single step forward, out of the deep shadows and into the fading twilight. My breath hitched. It had no face, at least, not one I could recognize. Where the eyes should have been, there were only deep, hollow pits, and its limbs moved with a jerky, disjointed motion, like a marionette being handled by an amateur. I didn't wait for a second step. I dug my paddle into the water and hauled. I didn't care about form or stealth, I just wanted distance. I could hear the water churning behind me, a frantic, splashing mess that felt deafening in the stillness. I didn't look back for a long time, not until I was in the middle of the lake, my lungs burning and my arms trembling. When I finally turned my head, the shoreline was empty. The figure was gone. But as I sat there, gasping for air, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The reflection in the water didn't match the sky anymore. Above me, the stars were beginning to poke through the purple haze of dusk. But in the water, right next to my kayak, the reflection was pitch black, and out of that darkness, two pale, elongated hands were reaching up from the depths, pressing against the underside of the surface as if it were a sheet of glass. I didn't sleep that night. I paddled all the way back to the launch point in the dark, my eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at the water. I sold that red kayak a week later. I told the buyer I was moving and didn't have the space, but the truth is, I couldn't stand the sight of it. Every time I looked at the hull, I could still see the faint, muddy smears of palm prints near the waterline. It took me 3 years to get back on the water. I thought I had moved past it. I told myself it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the thin mountain air. My friend Elias was the one who finally convinced me to go out again. He'd bought a pair of high-end sea kayaks and wanted to explore the mangrove tunnels near the coast of South Carolina. "It's different than the mountains," Elias had said, flashing that infectious grin of his. "It's vibrant. It's alive. You're never really alone out there, and that's a good thing." We launched from a small, private marina just after dawn. The air was thick and humid, sticking to my skin like a wet wool blanket. The mangroves were a tangled labyrinth of salt-crusted roots and waxy green leaves, creating a canopy that blotted out the sun in some places. It was beautiful, in a haunted, gothic sort of way. Elias was a few boat lengths ahead of me, his yellow kayak a bright splash of color against the deep browns and greens of the swamp. We were following a narrow channel that twisted and turned back on itself, the kind of place where you could lose your sense of direction in minutes if you weren't careful. "Check this out," Elias shouted, his voice echoing off the muddy banks. He had stopped near a cluster of roots that looked like the ribcage of some giant beast. Floating there, half submerged in the muck, was another kayak. It was a professional model, expensive looking, but it was battered. The seat was missing, and the fiberglass was covered in deep, vertical gouges, like something with very long claws had been trying to climb inside. "Looks like someone had a rough night," Elias joked, but I could see the unease in his eyes. I paddled closer, the tip of my boat nudging the abandoned craft. There was a dry bag still clipped to the bungees on the back. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and unzipped it. Inside was a high-end camera, a half-eaten granola bar, and a wallet. I opened the wallet. The driver's license belonged to a man in his late 20s. He looked happy in the photo, smiling in front of a mountain backdrop. But it wasn't the ID that caught my attention. It was the small, handwritten note tucked behind the cash. It only had 4 words on it, written in a frantic, shaky hand. It mimics the splash. "Hey, we should probably call the Rangers," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. Elias nodded, his bravado fading. "Yeah, let's get back to the main channel." We turned our boats around, but the tide had shifted. The narrow passage we had come through was now a confusing mess of bifurcating paths. The mangroves all looked the same twisted roots, the same hanging moss, the same oppressive silence. Then, I heard it. Thwip-plop. It was the sound of a paddle hitting the water. It was perfectly timed with my own stroke. I stopped paddling. Thwip-plop. The sound happened again, a second after I had stopped. It came from the dense wall of trees to our left. "Elias?" I whispered. "I heard it too," he replied, his paddle held ready like a weapon. We sat there for a moment, the only sound the distant hum of insects. Then, from the darkness of the mangrove roots, a voice called out, "Check this out." It was Elias's voice, exactly his voice. Same pitch, same inflection, same excited tone, but Elias was sitting 3 feet in front of me, his mouth clamped shut, his face as pale as a ghost. "Check this out," the voice repeated, slower this time, as if it were practicing the words. The silence that followed was heavier than the humidity. It pressed against my eardrums, thick and suffocating. Elias didn't move. He didn't even seem to be breathing. He just stared into the tangled mess of salt-crusted roots where that voice times his times voice had come from. I felt a cold sweat prickle across my neck, a stark contrast to the sweltering Florida heat. My mind tried to do what minds do in these situations. It searched for the rational. Maybe it was a parrot? A very talented, very macabre parrot? Or maybe some local kid was hiding in the brush with a recording device, playing a sick prank, but the logic didn't hold. We were miles into the backcountry. The tide was low, the mud was waist deep and treacherous, and we hadn't seen another soul since we launched 3 hours ago. Besides, the voice hadn't just sounded like Elias, it had his soul in it. That specific, breathy way he said the letter S. "Elias, we're leaving," I whispered, my voice cracking. He didn't respond. He was transfixed. Then, the water rippled. Not the gentle lap of the current, but a deliberate displacement. Something was moving beneath the surface, right where the mangroves met the black water. A pale, slender shape broke the surface for a fraction of a second. It looked like a finger, a long, grayish, multi-jointed finger that hooked onto a root and pulled. Flip-flop. Check. "This. Out," the voice said again. But this time, it wasn't just Elias's voice. Mid-sentence, the pitch shifted. It warped, sliding down into a wet, guttural growl that sounded like someone gurgling on a throat full of silt. Check. The is out. That was the breaking point. Elias let out a sharp, choked sob and plunged his paddle into the water. He didn't wait for me. He dug in with a frantic, splashing desperation that nearly flipped our tandem. I followed suit, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. We didn't care about stealth anymore. We didn't care about the serene beauty of the tunnels. We just wanted the sun. We wanted the open bay. As we tore through the narrow passage, the sound followed us. It wasn't just the voice anymore. It was the sound of something heavy dragging itself through the muck along the bank, keeping pace with us despite the dense vegetation. Every time I glanced back, I saw the branches shivering, the leaves parting as if something invisible was pushing through them. And then, I heard it. My own voice. "Wait for me," the thing in the woods called out. It sounded exactly like I did when I was tired. A little raspy, a little desperate. "Wait for me, Elias." Elias let out a scream, a raw sound of pure terror, and paddled even harder. We burst out of the mangrove tunnel and into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun on the open flats. We didn't stop. We paddled until our shoulders burned, and our lungs felt like they were on fire, only slowing down when we reached the middle of the bay, a quarter-mile from any shoreline. We sat there for a long time, drifting under the hot sun, staring back at the dark, jagged line of the mangroves. Nothing followed us out into the light. The water remained still. When we finally returned the kayak to the rental shack, the teenager working the counter asked if we'd seen anything cool out there. Elias just stared at him, his face still drained of color, and walked away without a word. I still think about that voice. I think about how it was practicing, how it was learning. If we had stayed, if we had gone into the trees to see what Elias was checking out, would that thing have found a way to sound even more like us? Would it be walking around today, wearing our voices like a stolen coat? But that wasn't my only encounter with the things that linger where the water meets the shore. 2 years later, I found myself in a completely different environment, the rugged, pine-choked lakes of the Pacific Northwest. I was solo kayaking this time, seeking the kind of isolation that only a deep-water lake can provide. It was a late October afternoon, the kind where the air is crisp and the water is like a sheet of dark glass. I was exploring a finger of the lake that was notoriously difficult to reach, a place where the mountains cast long, jagged shadows even at midday. I had been paddling for hours, the only sound the rhythmic times of my hull slicing through the water. I rounded a rocky point and saw it, a small wooden dock jutting out from a tiny, unnamed island. The island was barely more than a clump of rocks and 3 massive ancient hemlock trees. What drew my attention wasn't the dock itself, but what was sitting on it. A pair of shoes, small, bright red sneakers, perfectly aligned, pointing toward the water. I slowed my pace, a familiar sense of unease settling in my gut. There were no cabins on this part of the lake, no other boats, just those shoes. They looked brand new, the red canvas vivid against the gray, weathered wood of the dock. "Hello?" I called out. The silence that returned was absolute. No bird calls, no wind in the trees. just the heavy, oppressive stillness. I paddled closer, driven by a morbid curiosity. As I got within 10 feet of the dock, I noticed something else. Below the surface of the water, right at the end of the dock where the shoes were pointing, there was something white. I leaned over the side of the kayak, squinting through the clear, tea-colored water. It was a hand. A small, pale hand, reaching upward, its fingers just inches from the surface. My heart stopped. I reached for my phone to call for help, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped it. But as I looked back down, the hand wasn't there. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. The water was empty, just the dark, rocky bottom of the lake fading into the abyss. I looked back at the dock. The red shoes were gone. There was no splash, no sound of movement, just an empty, rotting dock under the shadow of the hemlocks. I didn't wait to investigate. I turned my kayak around and paddled with a cold, focused fury back to the main launch. When I got home, I searched the local news archives. I looked for missing children, for accidents on the lake, for anything that might explain what I saw. I found a report from 1974. A young girl had vanished from a lakeside campsite. They found her life jacket floating near that same rocky point, but they never found her. Her parents said she had been wearing her favorite pair of red sneakers. I don't go kayaking alone anymore. The water has a memory, I think. It holds on to the moments of terror, the moments of loss, and sometimes, when the light is just right and the world is quiet enough, it plays them back for whoever is unlucky enough to be watching. People ask me why I'm so afraid of the water when it looks so peaceful. They see a sunset reflecting off a bay, or a mist rising off a river, and they see beauty. I see a veil. I see a surface that hides things we aren't meant to understand. I think back to that day in the mangroves with Elias. I think about the voice that sounded like him, and the voice that sounded like me. And I think about those red shoes on the dock. Was the thing in the mangroves the same kind of echo as the girl in the lake? Or is there something more predatory out there? Something that feeds on our presence, that mimics us to lure us closer to the edge? I don't have the answers. I just have the memories. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the house is quiet, the wind is blowing through the trees outside my window, I hear it. A soft, wet sound. Thwip-plop. And then, a whisper in my own voice, coming from the corner of the room. Check this out. Am I overthinking this? Is it just the trauma of a few strange encounters playing tricks on my mind? Or is there something truly wrong with the places where the land ends and the water begins? What do you think really happened out there in the dark? Be careful the next time you take your boat out. Watch the shoreline, listen to the birds, and if you hear your friend calling you from the trees, whatever you do, don't go in to check it out.